Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a question that really shaped American foreign policy for more than 100 years. How did a nation, a country founded on staying out of other people's business, end up in the middle of the biggest, most brutal war the world had ever seen? We're talking, of course, about America's entry into World War I.
So let's just dive right in. When Europe basically exploded in 1914, the feeling in America was crystal clear. This is not our problem. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson actually won re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." So what changed? What could possibly happen to convince a country so dead set on being neutral to send its own people to fight and die in faraway trenches? Well, to get that, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the horror they were trying to avoid. You see, this wasn't just another fight between European monarchies. Right from the start, World War I was something totally different. It was the first time the world got a taste of a new, all-consuming kind of conflict they called total war. And what that really means is that everything, and I mean everything, in a country was now part of the war effort. The enemy wasn't just some army across a field, it was the entire nation on the other side. Factories that were building cars one day were suddenly cranking out tanks the next. Your local farmer wasn't just growing food for your town, he was feeding an entire army. For the very first time, that clear line between the soldiers on the front and the people back home just started to vanish. And this is what that war actually looked like. For years, the major powers of Europe were just stuck in this awful, grinding deadlock. We're talking millions of men living and dying in these muddy, rat-infested trenches, sometimes fighting for months just to gain a few feet of ground. It was a human meat grinder with no end in sight. And America wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. So what on earth could drag a neutral America, an entire ocean away, into this European nightmare? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a series of events, a series of provocations that pushed the country, step by step, right to the edge. Okay, first things first, let's follow the money. The U.S. government was officially neutral, but American banks, American businesses, not so much. They had loaned out over $2 billion to the Allies. Now, part of this was because of stronger cultural and economic ties to Britain and France. But what it really meant was that if Germany won, all that money was probably gone forever. So while America was talking neutrality, its wallet was definitely rooting for the Allies. The first real push came on the high seas. To try and break a British blockade, Germany unleashed its submarines, its U-boats, with a terrifying new policy: unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant they would sink any ship heading to Britain. Didn't matter if it was neutral, didn't matter if it was American. This was a direct attack on America's right to trade freely, and it put American lives directly in danger. This slide just perfectly captures the disconnect between what was being said and what was actually happening. On the left, you see Germany's official warning, printed in American newspapers. A seemingly civilized heads up. On the right, you see the brutal reality. When a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, a passenger ship, killing 128 Americans, the war suddenly felt very, very personal. It was a huge wake-up call that maybe, just maybe, staying neutral wasn't going to be an option. And this chart just lays it out in stark numbers. Look at how the amount of shipping sunk by U-boats just keeps climbing, and then it goes through the roof in early 1917. This wasn't just a line on a graph. Every single point there represents a sunken ship, lost cargo, and, in many cases, lost American lives. The pressure on the U.S. government to do something was becoming enormous. So, you've got money problems and ships being sunk. Both of those things were pushing America closer and closer to war. But there was one last thing. A secret message that brought the threat of war right to America's own backyard. It was an absolute bombshell. This is the Zimmerman telegram. British spies intercepted this secret message from Germany to Mexico, and it basically proposed a military alliance. It said, look, if the U.S. joins the war against us, you, Mexico, should attack the United States. And if you do, we'll help you get back all the territory you lost: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. When this got published in American newspapers, well, that was the final straw. The war was no longer over there. So in April of 1917, that's it. Congress declares war. But, declaring war and actually being ready to fight one, well, those are two totally different things. The reluctant giant was awake, but it was nowhere near prepared for the fight that was coming. Just get a load of that number: 200,000 soldiers. That was the entire U.S. Army at the time. To put that into perspective for you, the armies fighting in Europe had millions of soldiers and had been at it for almost 3 years. The US had to build a modern army from pretty much scratch, and they had to do it fast. To pull this off, the US government just went into overdrive. It was a complete transformation. All these new agencies popped up to manage literally every part of the war effort. You had the War Industries Board telling factories what to build, the Food Administration telling people what to eat, even the Committee on Public Information, which was basically in charge of shaping how people thought about the war. This was a level of government control over American life and the economy that was just unthinkable before then. It was a total mobilization of the entire country. And this wasn't just some top-down thing happening in Washington, D.C. The government's reach went into every single home. Posters like this one were everywhere, telling Americans to plant victory gardens in their backyards so more farm food could be shipped to the troops. Slogans like "Food will win the war" became a national rallying cry. And here's the really crucial point. Winning the war wasn't just about soldiers and guns. It was also about winning over the hearts and minds of the American people. The Committee on Public Information, the CPI, created these incredibly powerful posters and films and sent people out to give speeches, all to sell the war to a public that, just a few months earlier, had wanted nothing to do with it. All right, so let's shift gears. Let's head over to the battlefront and see how this brand new American force, these doughboys, or Yanks as they were called, actually managed to change the course of the war. General John J. Pershing was the man in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, and he had one absolute non-negotiable demand. His troops would fight as a separate, independent American army. He flat out refused to just use his men as replacements to plug holes in the tired British and French lines. The AEF was going to be America's army. The arrival of these fresh, eager American soldiers in 1918 came at such a critical moment. You have to remember, the Allied armies were exhausted, their morale was shot. These new troops were a massive shot in the arm, and they helped stop Germany's last desperate push on the Western Front. So when you boil it down, America's contribution really came down to two big things. It wasn't just the fresh soldiers that made the difference. It was the incredible power of the American economy. The endless stream of weapons, food, and supplies pouring out of American factories and farms was something the exhausted Central Powers just couldn't compete with. That 1-2 punch of manpower and industrial power is what finally broke that brutal stalemate. And this timeline really shows you just how quickly the tide turned. Once the full weight of the American military was in the fight, the end came with surprising speed. I mean, within months of the AEF really getting into major combat, the German leadership knew the war was lost. And so, at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns on the Western Front finally went silent. So, the war was over. Millions were dead, entire empires had crumbled, and the world was changed forever. But for the United States, its role in that new world had been completely, fundamentally transformed. You know, President Wilson had justified this war with this very grand, very idealistic vision. But whether or not the world was actually made safe for democracy, well, that's a whole other debate. What's not debatable is that the war marked a permanent shift away from America's old tradition of isolationism. The reluctant giant was now on the world stage, and there was no going back. The United States went from a country that prided itself on staying out of foreign messes to a dominant global power. And that single transformation set the stage for the next 100 years of American foreign policy, everything from World War II to the Cold War and beyond. And it leaves us with this fundamental question that, honestly, America is still grappling with today. What is the right role for the United States in the world? And what are the consequences of taking on that role, both for America and for everyone else?